Cosmic here. Welcome back to the channel, and today I wanted to do something a little bit different and talk about one of my favorite decks currently to play in Union Arena and break it down a little bit more for maybe people who haven't tried it out yet or more just a general tips and tricks. So overall in this video, we're going to go over the list itself, some of the good and bad parts of it, some common plays to make, and also specific combos to look forward to as you're playing the deck out to make sure that you're maximizing your turns and being as efficient as possible. So yes, I've also tweeted about this list. I've covered a little bit and talked about some of the other changes, but this is my most current version of the list. Now, I do have some pros and cons or good and bad there right on the side, but much of this will be kind of explained as we talk about more lists in the future, and you'll kind of see a general trend as we're going through this and talking about Union Arena lists overall. So some good things. Yes, this deck does draw a ton because you have things like the Shizuku and you have things like the Illumi triggers, and then also Chrollo is able to get more copies of the Phantom Troop abilities to draw you more cards. You are really just going to have a full grip at all times, which if you've played Union Arena a little bit by now, you know that when it gets to the late game, you're so desperate for those card draws and having to spend an action point. But with this deck, if you are able to stabilize and get things like the testing gate online, you can just outdraw your opponent and most likely then find your other raid targets to close out the game. It has a good damage too. The Illumi is something that we've seen time and time again with other cards that damage 2 often is just a gimmick that says get blocked and not a big deal, but with Illumi's ability giving you some extra card draw when you're able to play it, it is something that you can line up early, combo it with a removal, and then very quickly realize you can get ahead of your opponent because that double damage is very threatening when you play an early enough Illumi that's also drawing you cards. So it puts your opponent in a really rough position the turn that it's played, and then if they don't remove it immediately, it is still a very real threat they have to deal with. And then, of course, the other positive thing here just at the top end, especially for those that are maybe playing something like Green Bleach currently, is that it does have a very good impact target that you want to be playing anyways. Oftentimes, and especially specified slot is another one if you don't get the pieces for gone, you will find yourself just coming down to, all right, we're swinging with 4Ks, we're both at 1 life. It really just comes down to whoever hits that last impact or removal. So having a couple extra copies of impact and also doubling as removal in this case with Phaeton is really, really important. Now, of course, the cons or bad side of it as well. Weaker units. So we do have to spend a little bit of time of setting up. We do have things like Shizuku who, yes, are going to draw us a card, but ultimately they are only a 2K. In terms of like your early game setups and getting some good blockers, the only decent card that we really have is Maluki, and we're just playing a 3 of. I bumped this up recently because I wasn't sure about some of the other combinations, but it is something that, yes, it's a 3K, but we are really, really, really reliant on those 4K raid targets or Killua getting up to 4K to help kind of attack. But again, on defense, that leaves us with just the 4Ks being our raid targets, which means if our opponent has a lot of key threats early on, or like in Purple Bleach, how they have the 3 Ichigo, which can become a 4K attacker very early on, that is going to be difficult for us to deal with. Weak triggers. Now, this is one that probably deserves its own video, but something to talk about in general, and maybe you've been playing a bit by now and have seen this come up, but when we think about raid triggers, so I guess these next two are kind of the same thing. Weak triggers and no defensive raids. So what do I mean by that, right? As we've talked about in our deck building video, so definitely go, watch that, as I always like to give a plug for it every now and again, because it definitely breaks down deck building principles kind of step by step. But as you've probably seen, Purple Ichigo, or I should say Purple Bleach and Ichigo getting that when played defensive raid, which is then removing something and a 4K blocker, is absolutely insane for protecting your life, protecting your board, and just removing a key threat for effectively free, right? It's also what makes the Yuji in JJK so strong, is that it begins a 4K pop just for existing, basically. Yes, you do have to set up for it. So as I've mentioned, you do want to leave some cards in your energy line, which we'll cover later, so that you can, maximize off your raid hits. However, we're also very low on things like active triggers, and then color triggers in purple generally is a weaker trigger anyways, because it's something that we're either playing to the front line, and spoilers, in some decks we have to save it for raid fodder, or in this case it's Shizuku, which yes, can give us a block if we absolutely needed to, but we also want to make sure that we can get the when played off of our raid effect for Chrollo when we get the opportunity to, draw extra cards and have impact and stuff. So it's also a case of, hey, we just want to keep this on the board. And then also like Illumi, doesn't do anything when it's, rated out of life. Now, there are very niche situations where, yes, you just want to play it for free because you have like another Illumi into Illumi, or like Illumi 3 and Illumi raid in hand, and it's fine anyways because then you're able to threaten double 2 damage swings, which is generally enough to close out a game if it's late enough, right? But most of the time, you need to be saving that effect for some type of draw. So there are a couple combinations or a couple scenarios we're going to talk about later about when to set up, more defensive triggers and maybe some card options you might want to consider. But overall, this has been my favorite version of the list and what I would recommend from an overall starting point if you want to get into the purple Hunter x Hunter deck. And yes, it is something that you need to play, both the Phantom Troop side of it and the Zoldak family side of it. I know it's a little bit of a maybe flavor or immersion break, but ultimately it is going to be the best deck of the two. Moving on from there, just want to take a minute to talk about the SRs and kind of what makes them good, right? And this is more of just a general deck building principle or kind of Union Arena principle overall. So yes, I am going to kind of pull away from the deck building video just a little bit to kind of talk about this at a high level and kind of what makes a good card effectively and kind of what to look forward to, right? So does it remove a unit on play? We've seen something like the Ichigo, as I mentioned, with Raid, very strong effect. It does allow you to, be both offensive and defensive with it. Blue Bomber is another example, which can make it so strong. While it's only popping 3Ks, it still sometimes can be a big enough swing. So generally a rated card that can be a life trigger, or if it is just a high-end card like we've seen in the Killua from the Hunter x Hunter starter decks, if it has 2 action points, it better be removing something on play, right? Action point efficiency is very, very important in this game. Is the raid trigger also good on defense? As I just mentioned, with the Ichigo, it is something that is a key example of this. Bomber, Yuji, and JJK, you can start to see why some of these top tier decks are up there, but it is just something that you want to make sure that you can set up a board and, get rewarded for it if you have the required energy. And then how does the unit impact overall deck game plan? And what I mean by this is how well does it fit into the overall structure of what we're kind of already trying to do, right? As we've seen with maybe the Zoldak family and Silva, so using Illumi and Silva here as the 2 outside ends, right? Illumi gives you the when played. Silva has the ability to snipe and lets you cycle some cards while having impact. The downside is that Silva does require a bit more of a setup and requires you to take the entire turn off to do it because it does take 2 action points. It doesn't really do anything the exact turn that it comes into play other than being something that you can play to the back line. So unless you're already ahead or you have a turn where your opponent stumbled and maybe they're not finding the raid targets either, then sure, Silva by itself to the back line is going to be fine and something that you can set up for over a couple of turns. However, with Illumi having only the 1 turn of access to the effect, you really want to have something that can immediately capitalize it or have a key removal effect, which we'll talk about later, to immediately draw those 2 cards. But then also, as you maybe saw in our Purple Hunter x Hunter gameplay video, Illumi with being able to draw the cards, it's already going to stress your action points. It's always going to be like Illumi into special trigger or Illumi final trigger into Phaeton into another effect because you're going to draw a bunch of cards, right? So you're likely going to be able to play something else. So that can be a little bit difficult to line up. On the other side, we have Hisoka, which just doesn't really do anything. It's a turn disruption, and I get it. It's a very flavorful thing with his bungee gum, and he does have impact. It is a 4,500, but it does take 6 energy, which technically in this version of the deck isn't that hard to get to. It is a 4,500, which is really nice. It can block some of those 4Ks up front. However, it is a full turn slower than what we'd really like it to be, and we can just rely on the other half of the Phantom Troop to give us our impact when we really need it, and just getting more copies of the leader himself, right, to get impact and get extra card draw is generally where we're going to want to be anyways. So for those reasons, and of course drawing a card and adding this card to hand, those triggers really don't do anything for where we're at overall. That's kind of why we lean so heavily on Illumi and Chrollo as the top end in just terms of what they're able to do. Again, Raid is just such a strong effect that if I have to take a turn off to do something, it really needs to have some type of big game impact, or it has to be like part of a combo that we're trying to execute, which, spoiler, one of the Phantom Troop cards is that we're going to talk about a little bit later. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the special triggers. And yes, both of these can be played in this deck. You may need to swap around a few cards in terms of which one you end up wanting to do. But in the gameplay video that I featured on the channel, I did play Bandit's Secret because I just wanted to show the high roll combo that you can pull off with being able to kill something and then draw 3 cards. But overall, with where the meta is currently at, I would very strongly recommend running Dragon Head instead, because there's just so much Kurapika running around right now. Bandit's Secret can still be good against, admittedly, the rest of the format currently, and it's technically still good against the JJK decks we can expect to see, because Gojo doesn't really get played, unfortunately. So there are still some cases where, based on your local meta, it can be totally correct to play Bandit's Secret, but from a overall, meta standpoint, and what I would have to, I feel more comfortable recommending to people would definitely be running the Dragon Head removal, because again, there are certain cards of just, I need to get it off the field, and 5,000 does hit everything, at least in the current Union Arena meta. Now, the one thing I do have to talk about as well is Killua and Testing Gate. So Killua is a card that we did not have in the early testings of this deck and just in the Japan format overall. Killua is, it's a Zoldak family, which is super important for Dragon's Head. If you've been playing this deck, you'll find out. So it increases the consistency of the special. It is a double energy that we can play early, which lines up very well with what we want to be doing, because we do have to get to that 5 Illumi energy requirement very quickly. And also, it has pseudo step, or the ability to go from energy line to front line or vice versa when you need it to. And it also becomes a 4K attacker. So generally the way this is going to line up as you're attacking, you're going to have like your Illumi is going to go first because it's a damage 2. They're always going to block it. Then Killua becomes a 4K, so you can swing with him. And then you have Chrollo or whatever else at the other end, right? It's just another 4K attacker that admittedly the deck needed pretty badly, that also played into the synergy of what we are trying to accomplish. So overall, Killua is a massive, massive buff to this deck. Unfortunately, I'm still not going to say this deck is any higher than tier 2, just when we look at the sense of Kurapika and Purple Bleach, for all the reasons I talked about in this video already. But it's something that I have been so shocked at how much this one card changed it, because now it allows us to get something like Testing Gate into the deck, and actually is pretty good, it turns out. Testing Gate is something that does require you to have a 3K or BP or higher to make it a pure card draw. And spoiler, the older versions of this deck didn't really have a lot of 3Ks that we really cared to play, or couldn't play them to backline to get, the most value out of Testing Gate. Now, the other thing I'll say is, in general, there have been multiple games now where I'm just drawing so many cards, I do not care about having a 3K on the back. I just go, okay, here's my early energy fodder I set up, right? Just draw a card, discard a card, save us the action point. So Testing Gate has been surprisingly good, and just making sure that your mid or very late game turns are just grinding out your opponent very quickly, because you are, again, on an average amount of games, a number of times, you are going to outvalue and outdraw your opponent because you don't have to spend that action point. So it just allows you to extend your board further, turn after turn after turn, than your opponent. And then, of course, seeing things like extra final triggers can help out a lot with this as well. So this is just a combo that I have been continuously impressed by, and something that I definitely recommend people to check out again. Now, again, this is something that we go back to maybe an earlier video, that stages are still not something that you should be too excited to play, because a lot of them are a bit of hit or miss. But again, Killua, for all the reasons I just listed, this card has done so much for the deck, which then makes Testing Gate a reality again, for lack of a better word. So let's go into some of the obvious combos that I want to cover, or at least talk about, and I kind of given up 2 of them already. So Illumi, as I had mentioned, is something that you want to be playing early if you can, especially if your opponent is taking a little bit slower of a setup, to combo with a removal and then still chip in some damage to make sure you're drawing a bunch of cards. So with that said, because of Illumi's when played effect and getting to sideline something is kind of the key point, having one of these special cards, of course, is going to be your best thing to do, because it's generally one, you set up the 3-color Illumi the turn before, then you go Illumi for your first action point, special into your second action point, you draw a bunch of cards, and then you say, okay, now I can still play one more thing if I really wanted to. And if you get to live the total dream and get to do something like double Illumi, then you're able to threaten 4 damage. That can create some massive, massive swings in your favor, that if your opponent doesn't answer them, the game is going to be over extremely quickly. As I mentioned during Killua's section, Illumi by having damage 2, if it sticks after the turn that you played it, they are always going to want to block this first, which means it's going to turn on the kilowatt and make it a 4K attacker. So something that, doesn't come up too much because a lot of it, I think, gets boiled down to, am I swinging with 4Ks? But attacking order does matter a lot of times, same as it does with blocking, which may not be always obvious depending on, if you saw the active triggers or not, right? But it's something that as you play more and get more comfortable with, knowing how to attack and block properly is something that you'll pick up over time. But Kilo, again, being just another 4K attacker that we really wanted, is nice. And then the other one, which is Phaeton, which kind of goes more so into the other, raid target that we're playing. But if you go down to 4 life, it does have a 3K removal for it. And against the majority of decks in the format, a 3K removal with Illumi is good enough. Something to mention there is that this is also another 3K that we can play with the testing gate to draw a bunch of cards. It's also something that can trigger the when played from Chrollo's a rated effect, which can also just kill something else. So it's also just another good backline target. A little bit unfortunate that it's a 3/500. Like, for being a 4 energy 2 action point, I get that it's a lower energy requirement, which is why it's balanced the way it was. I wish they would have just made it a 5K, energy and make it a 4K body, just so it's a more reasonable attacker. But they didn't want it as strong as the other Phantom Troop, and I guess that makes sense from a flavor standpoint, right? But still something that I wish this was just tweaked a little bit differently, and it would be just the perfect piece for the deck. But overall, really making sure that you're utilizing your turns where either from a removal effect, again, being the special trigger, or some of the units that we're playing, you can trigger Illumi's ability, or just making sure that you're setting up your sequencings that Kilowatt is going to be a 4K attack and just really pressure your opponent's life total. Moving on from there to the leader himself, as I mentioned, we have the Phaeton, which is, again, something that you're going to want to set up the turn before because it is something that is, very action point heavy unless you have a final trigger. But generally speaking, there are some turns where you can do like double Chrollo into Phaeton to kill something that way while still having double impact. But then also with the Bandit Secret, it does allow you to do some cool things where it can copy Shizuku, but then Chloro's ability is going to give you the 3K copying the effect. Bandit Secret gives you another minus 3K to kill something. And then because you have the leader on your field, Shizuku is going to get to draw you a card. It is the only decent, I guess I should say, Phantom Troop that we are playing. Technically, you can copy Finks in a pinch. I've done that as well, but, obviously drawing a card is always better than having to draw one, discard one. So that's why I gave the spotlight here to Shizuku. So that is something to consider as well. However, there is only 4 raid targets in this version of the deck because, unfortunately, the color trigger is not that good in this version of the list. So we just want to be playing 4 of the Illumi color triggers. So admittedly, yes, that does come up sometimes and it does feel pretty bad. But when we get the effects and we have to draw a bunch of cards, again, generally speaking, we are drawing enough to where we are going to see multiple copies and be able to close out the game with impact. Now, the other part that I mentioned very early on is the other side of this being, what about some defensive triggers, right? If you are expecting a more low to the ground aggressive meta, something like Red Code Geass or Yellow Demon Slayer do have some very aggressive opening lines because they get to play units for free. Very long story short, we could see something then like Franklin come into play, which is a active trigger, which is really important. If you've been playing, you know how strong active triggers can be. But then also it does have that when played, all characters on your opponent's front line lose 500 BP until end of turn. So this creates a really interesting scenario where Chloro can come out of life, copy Franklin's ability, and if they're attacking with all 4Ks and you have a wall of 4Ks, well, suddenly they become 3500s and you can shut off their entire turn. Yes, this is obviously like the dream scenario for it all to happen. They got it on the first life sort of thing, right? It's not always going to line up that way, but it is something that's at least worth mentioning from a, overall tricks and tips that you could look forward to and try out. Again, I'm not a personal fan of it, but it is something to consider from a overall, what are some more defensive cards that we could, in theory, play while still having the double energy requirement. But again, unfortunately, it's not a 3K body, so it does not work with Testing Gate, other than just we have to rest something with a draw card to draw a card, discard a card, and he's never going to the front line anyway, so it works, right? Then that kind of is what it is from that side. Now, the last part I want to talk about here is just some overall, what does our opening sequences look like? Personally, I love going first with the deck, but going second is fine. Of course, we are going to be playing just our opening zeros. Finks allows us to draw a card and then discard a card. And then Shizuku is just sometimes fine to play on the back line to make sure we get to 3 energy to then draw another card. So going second, obviously, this is just a very key thing that you could do turn 2. And then if we had something like the Maluki, we can play that out and then go into an Illumi, or we can play the Shizuku to the front on our turn 2 and allow this for turn 3 if our opponent is being more aggressive. Generally speaking, right, the Maluki or just having some kind of 3K body to your backline is something that's going to be important for when you find those testing gate plays. But ultimately, keep in mind from our early to mid game options that we have, it is quite unfortunately just Shizuku and Maluki. As I mentioned, that is one of the weaker points of the deck from a overall what can block standpoint. So if your opponent's able to come out swinging, and if they have like the 2500s or the 3500 kind of key cards that we've seen out of maybe Green Bleach, they just want to rush you down, and that is their entire game plan, that can be a little bit difficult. Moving on from there, again, as I mentioned, going into like the next turn after that, we're going to have like Shizuku and Maluki to our front. This is going to be our either blockers or attackers threatening some damage. We want to start to set up an Illumi that can then hopefully get us a raid target on the following turn. But then also thinking about Testing Gate and Killua, because they both take a turn to activate because they come into play rested. In a perfect world, maybe we already have a double energy down. We've promoted the Chrollo and we have 2 spots. Great. Play Testing Gate, play Killua on the same turn. You have all your energy requirements you need. You have your extra card draw enabled. Perfect. Love it, right? There are other sequencings where if you know that you have the removal, or if you expect that you're going to be able to play the Illumi on the next turn, having the Killua go to the front line just to be a 3K attacker or 4K attacker, depending on how they block, that can also be fine as well, just to try to chip away at your opponent's life total, knowing that it is going to come back to your energy line eventually. Or you just draw a second one, and that's totally fine as well. So keep in mind that you do want to be thinking about what does our backline look like, because again, we have to only have the 4 spots. So like promoting Finks and just giving him be a chump blocker, right? There are going to be times where you're just throwing stuff out from your energy line into your front line, get a free block, try to be more defensive with it while you're setting up like Chrollo, Illumi, and then having a Testing Gate and Killua to your back line. So that is something that, of course, you'll just have to feel out for, if we draw too many zeros, then, we'll put Finks just to the front line. Like, play Finks to the front is totally fine as well. It still gives us the draw card, discard a card, and we are probably just trying to save room for something in our energy line. That said, never promote your Chrollo, because if people know your Chrollo Zero, I should say, if people know and it goes to your front line, they honestly might just use a removal on it, because we don't have that much fodder for our raid target. So please leave us on your back line. Never promote it. He's safe back there. Let him sit there. And then from there, going on to like our proper mid-game plays, right? And I'm just using Shizuku and Maluki here because, again, Shizuku is what you want to copy with the Phantom Troop leader for the draw card. Maluki is just a 3K, so it's a decent enough attacker early on. But then we want to go into things like Illumi with a removal, try to get some tempo back that way, pressure our opponent with the damage too, so hopefully they lose 2 units in a turn while still having to take a little bit of damage. So if they let all of this go through, then we might be worried because they might have something to crack back with that's even scarier. But generally, there's going to be a turn where you want to do like Illumi, do the special, do the final trigger to get 2 action points back, and then go into like Testing Gate, Killua, and try to set up from there. So yes, there is going to be a spot where you do often leave yourself 1 pocket of damage open. So that is something you have to be mindful of, like how much damage should I take? Can I afford to play the Killua to the front or the back, to set up with the Testing Gate? Or do I have to put it to the front line just in case they promote like a 2K, we need a blocker, and then hopefully I have another removal to then use Killua's effect, jump it to the back line, and then use Testing Gate, right? So sequencing in your main turn does matter a lot here, and something you definitely have to be mindful of as you're going through and playing this deck. Now, overall, our end game is going to be something like this, as I had mentioned, where it's just Illumi being able to threaten 2 damage, so they always have to block it. We have our leader, who is going to give us a very strong when played effect, which could, again, if you have Fade into the back line, can just make it where your opponent's blocks are really, really awkward. Again, they don't always have to remove something with this effect. If it can just put your opponent on the back foot and shrink something enough to where they're going to lose it either way, That's totally fine a lot of times as well. And then Killua, as I mentioned, becomes a 4K after both these guys attacked. So your last unit here on the right is just going to be a 3K or something just to get through a point of damage, right? Or you might have double Illumi. That fourth attacker doesn't really matter. That's more of just like, how did the game go to get here? Because we are then grinding out our opponent with Testing Gate and with the Phaeton kind of turnover turn and just finding more raid targets than our opponent, and generally going to win the game just through card advantage that way, because we're drawing so much with Testing Gate, Illumi, and Dragon's Head to, make sure we're getting the chip damage as well. So all that to say is, kind of when do I use a final trigger, right? This is one of the hardest parts of Union Arena, and kind of knowing when to get the most value, or kind of what are your key sequence turns to really come out ahead and get the most value out of it. Now, of course, there are going to be some turns where you're like, okay, well, I just drew a bunch of cards. I have 3 final triggers, and now I'm going to do like double raid, double special, plus this is going to attack. Like, I've done that to someone. So yes, there are going to be high rolls that happen with final triggers. Just again, having those turn extenders and getting more action points in your opponent is going to be very strong when we're already drawing so many cards in this deck anyways. That kind of the 3 key things that I'll look forward to, or kind of looked at in overall, of how can we get the most value out of restanding our action points. Up first, Testing Gate and just any 3K. As I mentioned, just getting this online in the same turn and as quick as possible, just to give you every single draw power you want going on for the rest of the game, can be very strong. So in that case, the card replaced itself, which is kind of a very important trend that you'll notice here, right? So very good combo. Illumi plus the Dragon Head removal, or any type of removal, because we're going to draw the extra cards, and because we just generally will draw into other pieces that we can then play, you're going to want to save one of your Underworld residents, or again, final triggers, for that moment. And then lastly, not as important, but if it gets to a late game, and depending on what deck you're going into, sometimes you're just going to want to make sure that you set up for a double impact turn if your opponent's going down to 1 life, so that even if they hit a final trigger, you will still win. And that's a little bit more of an advanced case that I won't, spend too much time on here, but definitely something to think about from a, how is this game plan going to go? What is my opponent's end game board state going to look like? And do I need double impact to close out the game? That can be extremely important to know from as early as turn 1. So this is where format knowledge and, just overall turn sequencing can really be important for Union Arena, because if you even mess up 1 turn with your action point usage, if you've been playing a bit by now, how much that can set you back. So there it is, a quick tips and tricks for our Union Arena Purple Hybrid list, as I'm calling it, or again, Phantom Troop and the Zoldyck family coming together. A little bit longer of a video, but again, I did want to just try something different and talk about this at a more individual card per card level. So if you've made it all the way here to the end, definitely let me know your thoughts if you want to see more videos like this, or if you just want to see more gameplay and just kind of local play and just stick to that. That's totally fine as well. Let me know. And then of course, tomorrow night at the time of this recording is going to be Eggman's 64 player event. So we will also have a meta report to look forward to later on this week, in just terms of what won, what's doing well, and kind of all that good stuff. So with that, my friends, stay safe, stay hydrated, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.